Richard Lawson had everything a man could want: wealth, power, prestige. His name was synonymous with success, whispered with a mix of admiration and envy across New York City. Yet tonight, as he sat alone in the city's most exclusive restaurant, his gaze fixed blankly on the raindrops streaking down the glass, he looked nothing like the self-made billionaire the world knew. If anyone looked closely, they'd see a man haunted by a ghost, a man weighed down by a past that refused to stay buried. The restaurant buzzed with life around him: laughter, clinking glasses, soft music, all the sounds of people enjoying lives that were full, satisfying, and whole. But to Richard, it was just noise. He stared out at the rain-soaked streets, where strangers rushed through puddles and headlights blurred in the downpour. It all looked gray and dreary, a perfect match for the emptiness he carried in his chest. Not that anyone would know. To the world, Richard Lawson was invincible, untouchable, a man who had clawed his way to the top and built an empire out of nothing. But there was one part of his life that no one saw, one truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of all his success. 23 years ago, he had lost the only person who ever mattered to him, Emily. She hadn't just been his wife. She was the spark that had ignited every ambition he had ever had, the one who had stood by him through every challenge, every late night, every uncertain moment. And when she died, she took with her the part of him that was capable of real happiness. To the outside world, he was unstoppable. But inside, he was a man left with nothing but memories. Memories of her laughter, her kindness, the way she made him feel like he was worth more than all the riches in the world. He'd spent years trying to fill the void she left behind, building his empire higher and higher, hoping that somehow, one day, it would be enough to silence the ache in his heart. But it never was. Tonight, he felt the weight of that ache more than usual. Maybe it was the rain, or the dim light, or the lonely silence of the table for one. He swirled the wine in his glass absent-mindedly, barely tasting it. For all his wealth, all his achievements, the world felt flat, colorless, lifeless. Success meant nothing if he couldn't share it with her. He thought back to the dreams they'd shared, the plans they'd made, the life they'd envisioned together. They had been young, filled with hope and ambition. They had wanted to conquer the world together. But now, all he had left was the shell of those dreams, like a faded photograph that no longer held any color. Richard's hand drifted to the wedding band he still wore, a habit so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. He could have taken it off years ago, but somehow he couldn't bring himself to. It was the only piece of her he had left, the only proof that she had once been real, that their love had once been his anchor in a world that now felt meaningless. And just as he was drowning in the familiar ache, a figure outside the restaurant caught his attention. Huddled on the wet sidewalk, sheltered only by a thin coat, was a woman, a beggar, her head bowed as if weighed down by the world itself. She looked up, and for a brief moment her eyes met his through the glass. There was something in her gaze, a desperation, a sorrow, that struck him deeply, pulling him out of his numb trance. Without thinking, Richard rose, leaving behind the warmth and luxury of the restaurant. As he stepped outside, the cold rain hit him like a wave, but he barely noticed. His eyes were on the woman in the worn coat, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. She didn't look up as he approached, too absorbed in the small, tattered bag she clutched against her chest. Something about her reminded him of Emily, or maybe it was the fact that her presence pulled him back to a time he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Richard slowed his steps, torn between walking past her and reaching out. Memories of Emily came flooding back, as vivid as if she were standing beside him in the rain. Emily had been everything to him, an anchor, a muse, and his greatest champion. Her laughter had filled his empty spaces, her kindness had softened his rough edges, and with her by his side, he'd felt unstoppable. She had made life worth living. He remembered the dreams they had shared, late nights spent planning a future that now felt like someone else's story. They had imagined themselves traveling the world together, building a life full of laughter, love, and adventure. Emily had believed in him before he even believed in himself, pushing him to chase his ambitions, to aim higher than he thought possible. She was the reason he had become the man he was, the reason he had built his empire. But it all felt meaningless without her. The beggar woman stirred, breaking his reverie. She glanced up at him with hollow eyes, her gaze tired and worn, and in that brief moment, he saw a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a spark, a connection, something inexplicable but undeniable. He felt an urge to help her, as if, somehow, through this stranger, he could honor the kindness that had once filled Emily's heart. Without a word, he pulled out his wallet and offered her $350, a small gesture for a man of his wealth, but a significant one for her. She looked at the money, then up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She thanked him softly, her voice shaking, and for a moment he felt a strange sense of peace, a release from the darkness that clung to him like a shadow. As he turned to leave, he wondered why he felt so drawn to her. Maybe it was the familiarity of her pain, the way she seemed to carry the weight of a sorrow she could never escape. Or maybe it was just that, after years of building his empire, he finally saw a part of himself in someone else, someone who had lost everything and was left with only memories to cling to. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the image of her face from his mind. The look in her eyes, the way she had thanked him, it all felt strangely personal, as if their lives had somehow crossed for a reason. He had never believed in fate, but something about this encounter felt different. He felt Emily's presence more than ever, as if she were watching him, guiding him, reminding him of the kindness she had always shown the world. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something other than emptiness. It was faint, almost fragile, but it was there, a spark of hope, a reminder of the man he had once been before grief had hollowed him out. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, he couldn't help but wonder if he was about to uncover a part of Emily's life he never knew, a secret that had somehow found its way back to him through a stranger on a rainy night. The next morning, Richard woke early, though he'd barely slept. The memory of the beggar's worn face and her haunting eyes lingered in his mind. He couldn't explain why, but he felt compelled to visit Emily's grave. It was a ritual he'd kept for years, a way to feel close to her, to keep her memory alive. But today, the need to go was almost urgent, as if something was waiting for him there. He drove through the damp city streets, the sky still gray from last night's rain. The air was thick, heavy, with a kind of stillness that made the world feel muted and surreal. As he approached the cemetery, his heartbeat quickened, a strange sense of anticipation filling him. He parked and walked along the winding path toward her resting place, lost in memories of the life they'd shared. But as he neared the grave, he stopped in his tracks. There, kneeling before Emily's headstone, was the same woman from the night before. She was hunched over, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly together. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and it was clear she was deep in grief. Richard felt a chill run down his spine, his mind racing with questions. Why was she here? How could she possibly know Emily? And why had their paths crossed twice in such a short time? He approached quietly, not wanting to intrude but unable to hold back his curiosity. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, her face streaked with tears. Recognition flashed across her face, and she seemed startled to see him. I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Richard was at a loss for words. The encounter felt surreal, like something out of a dream or a story he couldn't quite understand. But there was a familiarity in her gaze, a sense that their lives were intertwined in some mysterious way. "I didn't expect to see you here either," he replied softly, trying to mask his confusion. "How do you know Emily?" The woman took a deep, trembling breath, gathering herself. "We were friends, a long time ago, before life took us down different paths." Her voice broke slightly, and she paused, as if trying to find the right words. She was like a sister to me. She helped me through some of my darkest days. I come here when I can, to remember her, to pay my respects." Richard's heart tightened. He had never known about this friend, this woman who had shared a part of Emily's life he'd never glimpsed. Emily had been the kind of person who cared deeply, who would go out of her way to help anyone in need. But he had always thought he knew her better than anyone else. And yet, here was a part of her life that had remained hidden, a friendship he had never known existed. The woman looked away, her eyes distant as if reliving memories only she could see. "She was the only one who ever believed in me. When everyone else turned their backs, she stood by me. I owe her everything. And now I have nothing left but her memory." Richard felt a strange sense of kinship with her, as though they were two souls bound by the same loss, carrying the weight of a love that had been taken too soon. For years, he had believed that no one could understand his grief, the hollow ache he carried every day. But here was someone who did, a stranger who had loved Emily, just as he had, and who had also been left adrift in her absence. He wanted to know more, to understand this hidden chapter of Emily's life, to uncover the pieces of her he had never known. But part of him was afraid, too, afraid of what he might find, of the possibility that there were parts of Emily he had never truly understood. Still, he couldn't walk away. Not now, not when he felt closer to her memory than he had in years. "Come with me," he said quietly, gesturing for her to join him. "I want to hear more about Emily. I need to know who she was to you." The woman hesitated, as if unsure whether to trust him. But then she nodded, a glimmer of relief in her eyes. Together they walked through the quiet cemetery, bound by a shared sorrow, each of them carrying a piece of Emily's legacy. For the first time in years, Richard felt a faint sense of purpose, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he was about to learn something that would finally bring him peace. As they walked, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than coincidence. It was as if Emily herself had orchestrated this moment, bringing them together to share the parts of her that each of them had lost. And for the first time, he felt the weight of his grief begin to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of wonder at the mystery unfolding before him. That night, after parting ways with the woman, Richard returned home. but sleep remained out of reach. He lay in the dark, the encounter replaying in his mind, every word the woman had shared about Emily, swirling around like pieces of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. Her story had opened a door he didn't know existed, a glimpse into a side of Emily's life that he had never known, a life filled with kindness, compassion, and friendships he'd never imagined. But the mystery lingered. Who was this woman really, and what had happened between her and Emily? The depth of her grief was unmistakable. It was the kind of sorrow only someone who had loved Emily deeply could understand. Yet, as he thought back to those days with Emily, he couldn't recall her mentioning this friend. It was as if this woman had been erased from his and Emily's life, a hidden figure in the background of their love story. Unable to shake the curiosity and an unexplainable pull, Richard got out of bed, walked over to his study, and pulled out an old box filled with memories of Emily. Inside were photographs, letters, and little keepsakes from their life together. He sifted through them, hoping to find some trace of the woman he'd met, some clue that would explain her connection to Emily. But as he searched, he found nothing. Every letter, every photo was filled only with moments he and Emily had shared together. The absence of this woman in his memories was unsettling, almost eerie. How could someone who claimed to be so close to Emily have left no mark in the life he'd known with her? The next morning, feeling the weight of his questions, he called an old friend of theirs, someone who had known both him and Emily during those early days. He asked if they remembered a friend from Emily's past, someone who might match the woman's description. To his surprise, his friend hesitated, as if dredging up a distant memory. There was someone, his friend finally admitted, but it was a long time ago, Richard. I think her name was Claire. Emily took her under her wing, helped her when she had nowhere else to go. She had a rough life, always seemed to be on the edge. But after a while, she just disappeared. I always thought Emily kept in touch, but I never heard much about her after that. The revelation sent a chill through him. So it was true. This woman, Claire, had indeed been part of Emily's life, a part she had never shared with him. But why? What had happened between them that had been kept so secret, even from him? Richard felt compelled to find Claire again. He needed answers, needed to understand why Emily had kept this friendship hidden. He needed to know what it was about Claire that had drawn Emily to her, even to the point of visiting her grave all these years later. That afternoon, he found himself back at the cemetery, hoping that he might find her there again. And, as if fate were guiding him, he did. Claire was standing by the grave, her head bowed, her hands clasped together, lost in thought. He approached quietly, and when she looked up, there was a look in her eyes that told him she'd been expecting him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the questions he was about to ask. "Claire," he said softly, "I want to understand. I need to know who you were to Emily and why she never told me about you." She looked away, her expression a mixture of pain and regret. "I don't think you'd understand, Richard. Emily and I, we were from different worlds. She was your light, your partner. I was just someone she tried to save." Richard felt a pang in his chest. "Tell me, please. I need to know." Claire sighed, and slowly she began to speak. She told him about the nights she'd spent on the streets, homeless and alone, and how Emily had found her, given her food, shelter, and kindness when no one else would. She described how Emily had been her only friend, the one person who had seen something in her worth saving. But I couldn't keep up with her world, Richard. No matter how hard I tried, I was always falling behind, dragging her down. She deserved better than me." Richard listened, his heart heavy with a mixture of grief and compassion. In her words, he began to see a different side of Emily, a side he had known but never fully appreciated. She hadn't just been kind, she had been selfless, always looking for ways to lift others, to heal the broken, even if it meant carrying their burdens as her own. For the first time, he felt a sense of closure, a new understanding of the woman he had loved. Emily had been more than just his partner. She had been a light for those who lived in darkness, a beacon of hope for those who had none. And now, standing beside Claire, he realized that Emily's love was still alive, reaching out from the past to bring them both together. As he looked at Claire, he felt a stirring in his heart, a sense that perhaps his purpose now was to honor Emily by continuing her legacy. He could help Claire, support her as Emily had, and in doing so, keep a part of Emily's spirit alive. He reached out, gently placing his hand on Claire's shoulder. "Let me help you," he said softly. "It's what Emily would have wanted." Claire looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and gratitude. And for the first time, Richard felt the weight of his grief lifting, replaced by a quiet resolve to carry on the kindness that had defined Emily's life. In that moment, he knew that he had found a new path, a new way to honor her memory. Emily's legacy would live on, not just in his heart, but in the lives of those she had touched, beginning with Claire. And as they walked away from the cemetery together, Richard felt a glimmer of hope, a promise of healing, and the faint echo of Emily's love guiding him forward. In the days that followed, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that meeting Claire had been more than mere coincidence. It was as if Emily herself had orchestrated their meeting from beyond, nudging him toward a path he hadn't considered before. For years, he'd lived behind a wall of grief and isolation, locked away from genuine human connection. But now, something had shifted, and for the first time in decades, he felt a flicker of purpose, a reason to step outside his own sorrow. He found himself reaching out to Claire more frequently. They would meet in quiet places, cafes on the edge of town, park benches beneath towering trees, sharing stories of Emily, unraveling memories that each of them had kept hidden. Claire would recount tales of the time she and Emily spent together, the small acts of kindness that had kept her going when she was at her lowest. These stories painted a picture of Emily that was new to Richard, adding layers to the woman he thought he knew so well. Through these conversations, Richard learned of Emily's fierce compassion, her unwavering loyalty to those who struggled, and her quiet acts of generosity that she'd never mentioned. Emily had been Claire's rock, her only source of hope during the darkest days. And yet, in Emily's characteristic humility, she had kept these acts hidden from Richard, as if they were simply part of who she was, something unremarkable. Richard began to feel a strange sense of connection with Claire, almost as if they were both carrying different pieces of Emily's spirit. He had the memories of their love, their dreams, their life together. But Claire held a different part of Emily, a part defined by sacrifice, by a love that reached beyond the comforts of home and wealth. For the first time, Richard understood that he hadn't truly been alone in his grief. Claire had carried it too, though in silence and solitude. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, Richard finally asked the question that had been weighing on him. "Claire, why didn't you stay in touch? Why didn't you reach out to me after she—" After she was gone. Claire looked down, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sleeve. I thought about it, she admitted quietly. But I didn't belong in your world, Richard. I was just someone Emily helped. I didn't feel worthy of mourning her alongside you. She was my lifeline, my only friend. And when she died, I lost my way. Richard felt a pang of guilt. He had been so consumed by his own grief that he'd never stopped to wonder if there were others who shared his pain. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. You were as much a part of her life as I was. She saw something in you, something worth saving. And I believe she'd want us to be here together now. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but this time she didn't look away. Instead, she nodded, a quiet acceptance of the bond they shared. It was a bond forged not only by love for Emily, but by the loss that had bound them in a way neither could have anticipated. From that moment, Richard felt a renewed determination to carry forward Emily's legacy. He began reaching out to people he knew needed help, quietly, without fanfare, just as she had. He supported Claire as she worked to rebuild her life, helping her find stability, a place to live, and eventually, a purpose. With each act of kindness, he felt Emily's presence more vividly, as if she were there beside him, guiding him toward a new chapter of his life. For the first time since her death, Richard felt that he was doing something meaningful, something that honored Emily's memory in a way that his wealth and success never could. He had spent years building an empire, but now he was building something much more precious, a life lived in service to others, a life that Emily would have been proud of. As the weeks turned into months, Richard and Claire formed a quiet partnership, a friendship born of love, loss, and a shared devotion to the woman who had changed both their lives. Together, they worked to help others, carrying forward the spirit of kindness that had defined Emily's life. And in doing so, they found a way to heal, not by forgetting, but by remembering, by cherishing, and by giving back. For the first time in years, Richard felt whole again, as if the void Emily had left behind was no longer an empty ache, but a wellspring of purpose and compassion. In helping Claire and others, he was finally free from the shadows of his past, guided instead by the light of the woman who had been, and would always be, the love of his life. Months passed, and as summer faded into autumn, Richard found himself transformed by the path he had unwittingly stepped onto. His days had taken on a new rhythm, a purpose that transcended business deals and boardroom meetings. He spent more time with Claire, not out of obligation, but because, through her, he saw Emily's legacy unfold in ways he hadn't expected. Together, they organized small acts of kindness around the city, quiet gestures that reminded him of the things Emily had once done for Claire. They delivered meals to shelters, left warm clothes at bus stops on cold nights, and visited elderly people who had no one else. It felt surreal at times, almost like he was living someone else's life, but in the best way possible. Each small act brought him a sense of closeness to Emily that he hadn't felt in years. Through these moments, he began to understand just how powerful Emily's influence had been, not just on him, but on the lives she had touched quietly, without seeking recognition. In his pursuit of wealth and status, he had overlooked the simple beauty in helping others for the sake of kindness itself. Emily had understood this. She had lived it. And now, through Claire, he was discovering it too. One chilly afternoon, as they walked through the park, Richard turned to Claire, a question he'd been holding back finally escaping his lips. "Claire, do you think Emily knew that her life would inspire others like this? That her kindness would ripple out even years after she was gone? Claire paused, looking thoughtful, then smiled softly. I think she just lived her truth. She didn't need recognition or validation. She simply loved people, and that love left a mark. I think she would have been happy to know it still lives on, but she never expected it. Her words struck a chord with him. For so long, he had equated success with tangible rewards, wealth, respect, influence. But Emily's success had been something else entirely. She had built her legacy in the hearts of those she helped, in quiet, unseen ways. And now, through Claire, Richard was beginning to see that success could be something far deeper, far richer than he had ever realized. In helping others, he was helping himself, filling the empty spaces that had once been dominated by grief. He no longer felt the need to drown his pain in luxury or wealth. Instead, he found healing in each life they touched, each person they uplifted. And as he helped Claire rebuild her life, he could feel Emily's spirit guiding him, as if she were smiling down on them both. One evening, after a particularly long day, Claire asked him a question that caught him off guard. Richard, do you feel like Emily's still here with us? Richard considered her words, the weight of them settling into his heart. He looked out at the city lights flickering in the distance, and for the first time, he felt that his answer was clear. Yes, he replied quietly. I feel her in every kind thing we do, every person we help. I think she's been here all along, waiting for me to understand what really matters. A quiet understanding passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the journey they had both traveled. Emily's love, her kindness, her compassion, it was alive in them, binding them together in a way that transcended the past. As the days went on, Richard found himself letting go of the bitterness he had held for so long. Instead of mourning what he'd lost, he began to cherish what he still had, a chance to honor Emily's memory by making the world a better place, one small act at a time. And as he looked at Claire, he knew that he was not alone in this journey. They were partners, united by love, loss, and a shared commitment to keep Emily's spirit alive. In helping Claire, he had found a piece of himself that he thought was lost forever. And as autumn turned to winter, he realized that this was the greatest gift Emily could have given him, the ability to see beyond himself, to connect with others, and to build a legacy rooted in love and compassion. Here's an expanded and engaging version of the 7th section, where Richard realizes the profound changes within himself and the impact Emily's memory has had on his life and Claire's. As winter set in, Richard found himself reflecting on the journey he'd taken over the past months. His life had shifted in ways he never could have imagined. For years, he had clung to his grief as a way of holding on to Emily, convinced that letting go of the sorrow meant letting go of her. But now he realized that her memory was alive in a different way, a way that was warmer, softer, and filled with purpose rather than pain. Claire had become a fixture in his life, not just as someone who shared his grief, but as a friend, a kindred spirit who had understood Emily's compassion in ways he hadn't before. She had brought him into a world he had never truly known, a world where small acts of kindness and quiet empathy meant more than any business triumph or material gain. Through her, he'd seen how deeply Emily's kindness had touched those around her, and he'd begun to understand the ripple effect that one person's love could create. One evening, as they shared coffee at a small cafe, Richard found himself speaking words he hadn't even fully realized were in his heart. "You know, I always thought that by building an empire, I was honoring Emily, that my success was a tribute to her. But now, I see that my biggest mistake was trying to find meaning in things that could never bring me peace." Claire nodded, her eyes warm and understanding. "Sometimes we need to lose ourselves to find our way back. Emily wouldn't have wanted you to live in that emptiness, Richard. She would have wanted you to live fully, to find joy in helping others, just as she did." It was true, Richard realized. Emily's legacy wasn't one of wealth or prestige. It was one of quiet, unwavering love that reached beyond herself. And now he had a chance to carry that legacy forward, not through grand gestures, but through simple, heartfelt actions that made a difference, one person at a time. As the days grew colder, Richard and Claire continued their work, braving the bitter wind to distribute blankets to those who lived on the streets, delivering warm meals to shelters, and visiting hospitals with small gifts for patients who had no family nearby. Every act felt like a small tribute to Emily, a way to keep her spirit alive in the world she had left behind. And through it all, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging, of peace. He no longer needed to hide behind his wealth or his reputation. He felt content in the simplicity of giving, in the quiet joy of being a part of something greater than himself. The empty ache that had once dominated his life was gone, replaced by a quiet warmth, a gentle presence that he recognized as Emily's legacy. One night, as they finished handing out blankets to those gathered beneath an overpass, Claire turned to him with a question that seemed to echo the thoughts he hadn't yet put into words. "Do you feel like you're finally at peace, Richard?" He looked at her, realizing that the answer came easily, effortlessly. "Yes," he said, a faint smile on his lips. "For the first time, I feel like I'm where I'm meant to be. I think I've finally learned what it means to honor Emily, not by holding on to the past, but by living in a way that brings her love into the present." They walked back in silence, side by side, each step a quiet affirmation of the journey they had taken together. Richard knew that Emily would always be with him, not as a memory burdened by sorrow, but as an inspiration, a light guiding him toward a life filled with compassion and purpose. In helping Claire and others, he had found a way to heal, to rebuild his life in a way that was whole and meaningful. And as they walked through the snow-covered streets, he felt a sense of closure, a gentle release of the grief that had once held him captive. Emily's love was alive, not just in his heart, but in every act of kindness, every person he and Claire touched together. The legacy he had spent years chasing through wealth and ambition had finally taken shape. Not in the empire he had built, but in the simple, powerful truth that Emily had known all along, that a life lived in kindness was the truest legacy of all. Here's a heartfelt conclusion with a meaningful lesson, meant to leave a lasting impact on the reader. As Richard stood in the quiet of that winter evening, snow gently falling around him, he looked up at the dark sky, feeling the weight of his journey settle within him. He realized that life had finally given him a gift far greater than all the wealth he'd accumulated, one that couldn't be bought or measured, a second chance to understand what truly mattered. Emily had shown him, even in her absence, that real love doesn't fade. It lives on, woven into the hearts of those we touch, in the kindness we give, in the quiet moments when we put others before ourselves. She had taught him that life's greatest wealth is not found in riches or power, but in the gentle ways we lift each other, in the compassion we share, and in the love we leave behind. He turned to Claire, who was smiling at him with that familiar warmth, and felt a quiet, tearful gratitude. He knew now that his purpose was to carry Emily's love forward, not by grieving her loss, but by becoming the kind of person she'd always believed he could be. He had spent so many years trapped in his own sorrow, but now, through his friendship with Claire and the lives they touched together, he had finally found peace. And the lesson he carried was this: no matter how much we lose, no matter how broken we feel, we have the power to heal, not by clinging to the past, but by bringing love into the present. We honor those we've lost by becoming a light for others, by allowing their memory to inspire us to live fully, to give selflessly, and to find joy in the simple beauty of kindness. In the end, it wasn't the empire he built that defined Richard's life. It was the quiet acts of love, the lives he touched, and the legacy of compassion he'd carried forward. And as he walked away from that night, his heart lighter than it had been in years, he knew that Emily's spirit was alive, not in the wealth he'd once thought so important, but in the kindness he now gave freely. For those who carry grief, who feel the weight of love lost, there is a way through. Let go of the pain, hold on to the love, and let it guide you toward a life of meaning, of purpose, of kindness. For in the end, our true legacy is not in what we achieve, but in how deeply we have loved and how brightly we have helped others to shine. Richard's story reminds us that healing comes not by erasing our losses, but by letting them transform us, by allowing them to teach us how to live more fully, more generously, and more openly than we ever thought possible. And in this, there is a beauty that whispers that no matter what we lose, love is the only thing that remains eternal.